Australia isn't the first country people think of when they think of tanks. We're not known for giant weapons factories. We don't have a long tradition of mass-produced armour. And Australia certainly wasn't expected to build its own tanks in the early 1940s. But in the darkest days of the war, when Britain was overwhelmed and America was still recovering from Pearl Harbor, Australia decided to do something extraordinary, something risky, something almost impossible. We decided to build our own tank, the AC1 Sentinel. To understand how wild that decision was, you need to picture Australia in early 1942. Japan was advancing rapidly. Singapore had fallen. Malaya was gone. The Dutch East Indies had collapsed. The American fleet was damaged. And for the first time in modern history, Australia faced the possibility of invasion. We had soldiers. We had determination. But we didn't have tanks, and tanks were suddenly crucial. But there was a huge problem. Britain couldn't send us tanks. America couldn't either. All available armour was going to Europe, to the Middle East, or to the Pacific bases, still fighting for survival. Australia was low priority, so our government made a decision that almost defied logic. If no one could send us tanks, we would make them ourselves, from scratch, with no experience, no specialised factories, and almost none of the machinery used by major tank-building nations. The project was assigned to a mix of railway workshops, foundries, car engine specialists, and engineers who had never designed a tank in their lives. They were told, build something that can stand up to a real armoured threat, and build it fast. One of the most radical challenges was armour. Countries like the United States welded huge armour plates together using massive presses. Australia didn't have that capability, but what we did have were industrial steel foundries. So the engineers made a bold and almost unheard of decision: cast the hull and turret as large, single pieces of steel. Casting a tank hull was extremely ambitious. Nobody had ever done it at full scale before. Pouring molten metal into enormous moulds, letting it cool evenly, and machining it to precise tolerances was a high-risk move. But it worked. The Sentinel became the first tank in the world to use a fully cast hull and turret. Even the later American Shermans only had partially cast components. Australia was first. Then there was the engine problem. Australia didn't have tank engines. We didn't even have engines powerful enough to move a 30-ton steel vehicle. So the engineering team improvised. They took 3 Cadillac V8 car engines and bolted them together into a single power unit. 3 engines, 1 drive shaft, working in sync. It sounded like a recipe for disaster, but the engineers knew exactly what they were doing. The triple engine setup, sometimes called the cloverleaf, actually worked brilliantly. It gave the Sentinel about 400 horsepower, enough to move the tank reliably. It ran smoothly and had fewer breakdowns than many British tanks of the same era. For a jury-rigged Australian power plant, it performed better than anyone expected. Then came the gun problem. Australia didn't have tank cannons in production. The factories had never built one, so the engineers designed the tank around the British 2-pounder gun, which was small by later war standards, but reliable. It wasn't ideal, but it was what we had. And for the time, especially in early 1942, it was workable. By mid-1942, the very first Sentinel rolled out for testing. The people watching expected something clunky, fragile, or unfinished. What they saw instead was astonishing. The tank was stable. The engine configuration worked. The suspension handled rough terrain. The turret moved smoothly. The gun fired reliably. The cast hull was strong and resistant to cracking. Australia had built a functioning tank, not a prototype, not a mock-up, a real tank. It shocked even visiting American inspectors, who noted how remarkable the achievement was, given Australia's limited industrial base. By 1943, 65 production AC1 Sentinels had been completed. They were never sent into combat, not because they failed, but because the world had changed. The threat of invasion had faded, and the United States was now sending Australia large numbers of Shermans and other tanks. There was no longer a need for a large domestic tank industry, and the AC1 production line was shut down. But the story didn't end there. Australian engineers pushed ahead with improved models, the AC3 Thunderbolt and the AC4, which would have mounted the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun. These upgraded Sentinels were serious contenders. The AC3 featured thicker armour and a newly designed engine arrangement that put the 3 Cadillac engines into a single radial style block. The AC4 was designed around a gun capable of destroying German Panthers and Tigers. Both advanced versions worked in trials. Both showed great promise, and both were cancelled before production because the war's priority shifted and imported tanks were now available faster and cheaper. Even though the Sentinel never saw combat, the engineering lessons were huge. The cast hull method proved that Australian industry could innovate. The triple engine system proved that unconventional ideas could succeed when executed well. The suspension and drivetrain design showed that Australia could adapt foreign technology and improve it. And the entire project demonstrated that in a moment of crisis, Australians could build advanced military hardware from nothing. The Sentinel wasn't the heaviest, the fastest, or the deadliest tank of the war. It didn't become an icon like the Sherman or the T-34. But what it represents is uniquely Australian. Doing something we weren't expected to do because we had no choice. Solving problems with whatever we had. Innovating under pressure. Building something that should have been impossible. And through that effort, through the railway workshops, foundries and factories that worked day and night, the AC1 Sentinel rolled out as proof that Australia could step up when the world shut its doors. The Sentinel worked, it existed, and it stands today in museums, in photos, and in memory as a symbol of Australian ingenuity, resilience, and quiet engineering brilliance. This is the story of the tank Australia was never meant to build, but built anyway. The AC1 Sentinel. A machine born from necessity, crafted by determination, and remembered as one of the most remarkable achievements in our military history.